I used sharing, Kat.
Am I going to be sharing?
Yeah, you're sharing the slides, aren't you?
I am. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Let's get this thing going. So I am Kat Swatell. I'm the chair for the society track, and you're currently on the society track right now. This is the Keeping Us Safe session. And today I am joined by Rachel Murphy and Julie Pierce, and we are very excited. And Rachel is going to be up first. And she is the CEO at Different, and Different is a company that's focused on creating positive change by ensuring that public services truly meet the needs of the people that they're intended to serve. Imagine that. And I believe they're specifically focused on healthcare and government. And Rachel has a history of amazing high profile positions in the tech world. Yes. So we're very pleased to have you here today, Rachel, and awesome to have you kick off on this track. I'll go ahead and share.
Brilliant. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Kat.
Can you see the slides?
I can.
Cool.
Brilliant. So thanks very much for the intro. I'm Rachel Murphy, CEO of Different, and as Kat said, I'm here today to talk about how we use Wardley mapping to keep us safe. So next slide, please. We got a phone call on Sunday night. So going back first slide. Brilliant. We got a phone call on a Sunday night from the NHS, and they asked us to stand up a multidisciplinary team, literally the following day. The ask really was about designing and building a brand new home test ordering service within an 8-day period. And the ultimate outcome here was actually about getting key workers who didn't have COVID-19 back to the front line. And you know, in case that challenge wasn't interesting enough already, the team were never going to set foot in the same physical location as we were all actually working remotely. Now, whilst that feels completely normal today, at that time, that was alien to most people, and most teams that were working from a collaboration perspective, especially if they hadn't met before, were physically in a room together. So next slide, please, Kat. And in way of delivering the impossible. So if we go back to March 2020, when the COVID-19 crisis was escalating, and I think we naturally move on so quickly that it's quite easy to forget what that period of time was like. But the reality was we were all being sent home from work. We had those daily briefings from senior government members. The supermarkets were being cleared out of all essential supplies. I mean, of course, that aspect has continued for various other reasons. But the reality was more and more people were starting to show symptoms of COVID and were actually having to self-isolate because we were desperately trying to curb the spread of the virus. And the reality, of course, was there was I think a much higher level of kind of fear and concern from people. Everybody was on hyper alert. And as we started to understand how the virus showed up in people who were infected, The reality was at that time, we didn't have the testing capabilities that we now have. So tests for COVID were only just beginning to be developed. And therefore, anyone who showed any symptom at all of, a slight cough, cold, they had to be cautious and they had to isolate straight away. And the reality is that actually included about 40% of key workers from frontline NHS roles. And because we didn't have an easy way to confirm whether it was COVID-19, there were thousands of people who were isolating unnecessarily, where symptoms could well be just a common cold or allergies, but without the ability to take that test and find out, they had to isolate. Now, this problem kind of can't really be overstated. This was the worst possible time to have gaps from a workforce perspective within the NHS. So the NHS needed to be at full capacity and some. And if we move on to the next slide. Brilliant, thanks, Kat. So in way of the approach that we actually took to this, how do you go about achieving something like this in a week? And the reality for us is that normally, if we were tasked with designing a service from scratch, we would be running a dedicated discovery phase. We would be doing loads of research and analysis to be really clear that we'd fully understand the problem. And then we would move through the normal project phases. So we'd go through an alpha, we would test out some new ideas, we'd then do a beta before going live. And even live, we would be slowly testing and then scaling the service. And the reality is we didn't have the luxury of time. Everything was super urgent. And we had to move quickly, and we had to take a much leaner approach than normal. So what we did is we assembled a small disciplinary team literally overnight. So the call came to me at 10 p.m. on a Sunday. That night we assembled the team. They started the Monday morning. So there was a product manager, there was a service designer, and there was a technical architect. And we actually partnered with experts from other organizations to deliver that end-to-end service. So we were working with Amazon to fulfill the test kit orders. This was before the post office got involved in providing those specialist post boxes. We worked with an organization called Randox to do the lab analysis of the tests. And it meant that really quickly we had to get aligned, we had to build a relationship, and we had to get behind that joint outcome that we had to deliver. So we had to work as one team really quickly. And the only way that you can do that and deliver a service like this in a week was to be truly agile and truly collaborative. And we very quickly got into a rhythm of kind of lean iterative cycles. So each hour we would be rapidly moving from collecting insights through research through to mapping out the service. And we use Wardley mapping as a joint tool between all entities to actually create that service map. And we started sketching interfaces and building them immediately into code. So it was literally, almost a thought do instantaneously to make sure we were anywhere near that timeline. And then we were testing our ideas and we were making improvements straight away. So based on the feedback that we were getting from users and stakeholders. And this really was the key to the success of this service. So by breaking down those silos, by having a tool that we agreed we were going to use in Wardley mapping, meant that we could we could clear out any barriers between research, design and build, and we could adopt that kind of one team approach super quickly. And then testing and learning and iterating happened literally overnight. And it's really important to note that whilst we did this at breakneck speed, the reality is we didn't have any other option. We didn't cut corners on things that really mattered. So ensuring that the service was inclusive and accessible. So alongside the rapid build of the digital service, we also established a contact centre to deliver offline support. So we wanted to allow people to order test kits over the phone if they couldn't get online and do it through the digital service. So if we just move on to the next slide, please, Kat. And if I talk a little bit about what we actually delivered during that period of time. So the outcome on day 8 was that we launched a new service, and we launched it with a cohort of frontline staff from London Ambulance Service. And they went through the process of actually ordering tests and confirming whether or not they needed to isolate or could return back to the ambulance service in London. And off the back of that, we then did a diary study and feedback via text and phone calls about the experience before, during and after ordering the kits, and actually speaking to the contact centre daily to gather feedback on any issues, and fed those insights directly into that cycle of iterating and improving the service. And this service scaled up massively in a short period of time. So within a month, we'd launched nationwide for key workers. And a couple of weeks later, post a ministerial commitment, we actually had to scale for citizens to order test kits as well. So again, you know, the original outcome and the original ask got larger literally by the minute. And within 3 months, we had distributed over 1 million test kits. So it's a massive achievement for the team that were involved, and something that I'm particularly proud that Different played a part in. And the team all got a letter from Boris Johnson in way of thanking them personally for their contribution in the fight against COVID-19. And if we just move over to the final slide, please, Kat. Of course, the reality is the service didn't stand still. So the system has subsequently evolved into everybody getting tested via packs that have been sent out, via the packs of lateral flow tests that we all order in on a regular basis to keep ourselves safe now. The same service has been developed upon to create the PCR in location, but also the vaccinations, and ultimately, the COVID passport using the NHS app. So in way of an outcome, we absolutely ticked that box. But I think there were a couple of components that enabled us to really move at pace. And for me, Wardley mapping played such a fundamental part in that, because it was a tool that unified that team and those partners. And it was a language that everybody spoke, which meant that we could collectively move at pace. There were many other tools that we used along the way. But in way of a central tool that helps design and build and iterate the service, it was the Wardley mapping. And I'm handing back over to you, I believe, Kat.
Cool. Thank you so much for that. That was a rare glimpse, I guess, behind the scenes of something that we all saw play out in the news and everything like that. So very interesting. Thank you very much. Yes, so we do have some questions in the chat. And the first one is, what was the biggest challenge or roadblock in this endeavor? I don't know how you're going to pick the biggest, because I think there were many.
I think that's a great question. I would say at that time, the biggest challenge and the biggest roadblock was the fact that whilst we're a digital business and we probably worked part-time remotely, we hadn't all fully worked remote for an extended period. And we were then working with partners who we knew of, but we hadn't worked together before. So I think, you know, the NHS at that time, and now actually, runs, I think, a lot on goodwill. But the level of goodwill and the level of desire to respond to the challenge at that time was like something I've never seen in my lifetime. I think the ability for people to pull together, get around a problem and really respond to that remotely was the bit for me that I think was probably the biggest challenge, and the biggest challenge that we overcame. And the fact that some of the team at Amazon were familiar with Wardley mapping as well made the challenge a bit easier. So what we weren't trying to do was train people on, you know, on the use of that as a model. We happened, you know, you can call that good luck or, I don't know, divine intervention, but we happened to have a team who were familiar with and wanted to use that actively as a tool to kick the tires on the service build. And the reality, of course, is, Kat, you know, building a digital service is only ever a small part of the challenge, especially with something like this. You know, the logistics were probably a bigger part of the service build, because our job to a certain extent was made easier by the good work that's happened with government digital services. You know, we plugged into Notify, so we were reusing a lot of, you know, of tools that had been built out before.
Yeah, you touched on a couple things there that I wanted to ask. I don't know that they are questions in the chat, but this is my show, so I'm going to ask. I was just struck by the irony, right? That you are creating something to get people physically back to work, and you're having to do it. You're having to create this thing to get people physically back to work in an entirely remote way. So that felt like...
It's a good question, that. So we could have physically gone in and been based in Wellington House. So we could have done that, but my decision as a business owner 2 weeks before the national lockdown was that I pulled all of my people off client side, and this didn't make me particularly popular with all of our customers. We did it in consultation with them, but for somebody who spent many years working in healthcare, and I don't know whether it's driven by the fact that I'm sort of chronically asthmatic, but I was super cautious when this landed about the impact. And I guess I really felt that I had a duty of care to staff to have them work remotely. So the NHS would have provision space for us in Wellington House. And it's not that I'm averse to travelling to Elephant and Castle. It was much more around the fact that I was nervous about having people in a physical environment when we were dealing with something that was so unknown. But you're absolutely right. There was some irony around the fact we were serving up a solution to get people back to a workplace, but we were all working remotely.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. And then the other thing that really struck me was the thing that we've all been talking about, like Simon was talking about it this morning. We've all been talking about this, but just the logistics of things like this that are really a blend, right? There's a physical element and there is a digital element, and Those supply chains have been wild in the past year. Distribution has been wild in the past year and a half, and for a variety of reasons, right? Not only COVID. So I guess I'm just really curious about that interaction, how you had to think through that.
So I think the first part of your question there, Kat, the service, that kind of service design role is such a specialist one for that reason. So I think there's an assumption a lot of the time the service design role is building pretty digital services, and that really does it a disservice, because the reality is, to truly build a service, you must be considering the supply chain, the logistics, and the end-to-end, the stuff that touches the digital, but also, and perhaps more importantly, the stuff that sits outside. And that was absolutely part of the challenge here. And I think the goodwill probably drove some of that stuff through, because were all contracts in place? Was everybody under a purchase order? We know that they weren't. I know that we weren't. So there was an awful lot of us taking a bit of a punt, phone calls late on a Sunday night, and doing everything we could to make it happen. Is it the right way to do it? Probably not. But the reality is, and I sincerely hope this is the only pandemic I'll see in my lifetime. So I think everybody, for people that work in healthcare and have a real love affair with it, the pandemic to a certain extent is the ultimate calling. So that, I guess, probably drove some of that behavior. But I do think I still think there's a lot we need to learn around supply chain when we're either working in government or healthcare, and understanding the logistics of that and the impact that external factors can have. I mean, we've seen it again recently with petrol and other bits. I mean, the impact of something that looks to be trivial is absolutely huge. And I have a personal view that people probably got so excited about the petrol shortage because they're so frustrated, having had 18 months of being kept kind of in a enclosed environment anyway. So I think there's I think if I had to retrain, I may be a service designer, which will terrify my design team hearing that concept, actually, Kat. But what a fascinating role.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that was actually my third question. I was going to ask you if you could explain to the audience, because I've noticed not everyone understands what the role is of a service designer. But it just keeps coming up. Like, you talk about this, right? Jay Bloom has talked about the intersection of service design and Wardley maps. So I think it's a thing. If you could talk about it for a second.
Of course. So I think the service designer for me is probably one of the most interesting roles in our business, and it's a role that really takes some of the learnings from the user researchers and works with an organization, or in government or NHS speak, departments, to understand and to blueprint out what that service can look like, mindful of any user research, but also of any business research from a constraint perspective, and starts to wrap an end-to-end service around that. I think it's an incredibly powerful role as we move from old school kind of project management and the waterfall ways of working in government and healthcare, and we move to a much more service orientated landscape. So it's a fascinating role, and there's lots more there to do, I think, in way of developing that as a profession.
I actually keep this book right next to my desk.
I thought you had someone at the door there, Kat. I wondered what was happening.
It's right here by my desk. It's the Service Innovation Handbook. And I think this, like the explanation of service blueprints in here was so accessible for me, not coming from a design background or anything like that. So highly recommend. There's
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
the
go
other
ahead.
bit is the good services book. So the good services book is well worth a read in way of understanding the impact that those services can make. Again, a fantastic point of reference for me, and as a business, something we actually we bought a copy for everybody at work at different. Yeah, I mean, just a fantastic learning tool.
Awesome. There's one more question in the Q&A here. So talking about scale, you had to scale up a couple times through your story. What were the biggest challenges in those big scale ups?
Okay, I'll be honest with that. The biggest challenges with scale-ups were ministerial commitments that were unexpected. But for anyone who spent any time in government or healthcare, that becomes standard to a certain extent. And under these circumstances, you can understand it more. So the original ask was about key workers, and in short order, and I mean very short order. So if you imagine we got that service out after 8 days, within 2 weeks of it going live, there was a request for citizens to start to use it. So it had been designed, and the capacity issue there was probably less logistics, more supply chain from a lab perspective, because the lab capacity, a lot of it was being used in different ways. So it was, almost a ring around to start to think about how we could scale that up further. So the scaling wasn't restricted from a digital perspective. That side of it was very easy. And that was easy because of the good work that had been done before. But it was more about the access to labs and the ask went from a potential workforce, NHS workforce of 1.52 million. And if you imagine a percentage of that being frontline and 40% of that potentially isolating to being, 70 million people, and so it was a hell of an ask, there's planning that needs to happen there. But again, it goes back to your earlier point. It was the logistics and the supply chain there that were the bit that we needed to scale up, rather than anything on the, the digital front end.
I will just point out that this isn't a UK only problem, right? In case anyone thought that it was. I think the 2023 budget priorities just came out from the Biden administration, and I think the TLDR is, holy smokes, supply chains. What the heck do we got going on here? So certainly front and center for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these things only come into the fore when you have a problem. So it's very easy to just assume everything works like clockwork, but at the point that, a part of the system is pinched for whatever reason, and, it's like a stress ball. You squeeze it, something's coming out the side.
Yeah. Julie, do you have any questions for Rachel before we move into your session?
Not questions, but there were a number of points that Rachel was making that were also sort of resonating, and maybe from my talk, which is about a completely different domain and might look to have nothing at all to do with what Rachel was talking about. But there were a few points, and maybe draw them out where there were similarities.
Cool. Okay. Are you ready to move into?
I think I'm ready, so I shall try and share my screen. So here goes.
All right. I should say, while Julie is figuring out the screen sharing, always fun with Zoom, she is the Director of Openness, Data, and Digital at, sorry, I'm going to mix up, the Food Standards Agency, right? I got it right. I always go to say the American one. And I am so pleased to have her here with us. It's certainly relevant for keeping us safe, right? So Julie, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you very much. So first, just to check, you can see my screen.
Yep.
Cool. So yes, as the title of this talk might imply, this is an update. I'm Julie Pearce, Director at the FSA, with a wide range of responsibilities, including all things digital, tech, and also all of our scientific research. So, cool. Yeah, the Food Standards Agency. We are here to ensure the food you all eat is safe and what it says it is. And we do that working with local authorities, our sister organisation in Scotland, industry, third sector, other government departments, and also international. Half our food is imported. So those international regulators, such as the US FDA, are really important to us as well. So there's a wide community of people trying to ensure the food you eat is safe. So mapping, this has been a long journey. It's been a great journey, but we've been at it for a while now, maybe about sort of 5 years or so. And here's a little picture, one of my favorites, from Map Camp back in 2018. And some of you here today may have heard me speak previously about our maps and our experiences. So I'm here today to talk about our latest mapping adventures. So just going back to the past, where did we start? And that's what this map is a map of. We started mapping our as is and then to be IT. So we started with the technology the FSA needed to operate as an organization. That was relatively familiar sort of stuff. Whilst we were looking at moving to cloud, it was still relatively tangible, the sort of stuff we were talking about, whether we were talking about hosting or we were talking about APIs or we were talking about sort of various digital applications. We implemented the maps. We implemented what we saw. So this wasn't a theoretical exercise, but we decided to sort of go somewhere else. So the next place we went to was looking at something slightly less tangible, and that was our data and the data services. And that was a little bit different and slightly harder for us to map, but we did map those data services. But then where to go next? We wanted to go outside the FSA, and we wanted to map that wider world, the context in which we operate. That's where the people are, that's where the businesses are that are manufacturing and delivering all of this food. And that's where we need to be operating to make a difference. So some examples of our most recent adventures in mapping. The food hygiene rating scheme, I'm hoping everybody recognises this little green sticker. And the FHRS sticker is the jewel in the crown for the FSA. It sticks on food outlets' doors or windows, and it's there to help consumers decide where to go eat, to choose the hygienic places, the safe places to eat. It's beautiful in its simplicity. It's a green sticker sticking on every door. It's very recognizable. But because it's so great, somebody suggested that we change it. We change what it means, we change its scope, and we try and do more with it. So we could add other things into it. Maybe we add something around whether the business was good at food allergen management. We could also address digital businesses. We could mandate display in England. At the moment, that's only mandated in Wales and Northern Ireland. So there were lots of ideas as to how we could change this sticker. So this was an existing thing. It wasn't a new thing, as Rachel's been described. This was an existing thing. It'd been around for years. And we all thought we understood it really well, how it worked, how it was used. But before we went to change it, we said, let's actually map it. So here's a map. It's an aggregated map. It's one of these illegible maps. I've never found a really good way of sort of showing maps such that anyone else other than the mapper can really read and understand it, but that doesn't matter. So we were also working virtually. We were using Miro boards for the first time. And on this map, you can even so see some of the complexity of understanding the different actors in this space. Even for something so simple, there was the FSA, there were businesses, there was the consumer, there were the local authorities. And somewhere in the middle, in one of those little red boxes, that's the little green sticker. But as we mapped, we could pretty quickly see that that little green sticker was sort of exploding in front of our eyes. It never quite dawned on us the number of different actors, the number of different actions and relationships that just enabled one sticker to appear on one restaurant's door. So even whilst this is looking a bit of a mess, this in itself is a tidied up version of the map. And here we have sort of the final version, if such a thing exists in mapping. And some of the points I might draw out here is that up at the top, we can see the consumers. They're using the sticker. They're using the sticker to try to decide where they eat. And that's what it was designed for. That's what we thought was going on here. But we also realized that there were many other users of the information in the sticker. So up on the right-hand side, we've got other types of users, maybe businesses themselves wanting to get a high rating because it generated confidence in their offer. They were using it as sort of like an internal assurance measure. Insurance companies ensuring that those businesses using the rating as an independent measure of confidence in the management of the business. That would impact the premiums they offered. People outside of the food sector using the open data as a register of places that weren't private homes. So where food is sold, could be retail, or it could be your office canteen, or it could be a hospital. They were pulling in that data just as a good data set. So we called those freeloaders because they were consuming all of this information and the sticker wasn't designed for them. Also within this map, we were starting to see the feedback loops. And I think that's one of the things that maps draw out. And maybe those are some of the things that should be designed in or sometimes not designed in, are those feedback loops in the system. And we could start to see those. So we were seeing a business getting a poor rating, actually driving pressure on local authorities to re-inspect that business. So we were driving load on local authorities, which we hadn't quite appreciated. But also we realized those freeloaders, they were putting pressure on the system to improve. So rather than being freeloaders, they were becoming more and more important as to the influence and value they were offering to the whole of the system. And many of the people who were exercising the power on the system weren't actually the consumers. They were everybody else operating around the whole of the system. So our understanding of how the whole system worked is starting to shift. The next thing we tried to do was to move the map. So in the boxes, pink boxes numbered 1 to 4, these are opportunities where we could start to see places to intervene. So we could see opportunities to tighten up the flow of information throughout the whole system, make it better, make it faster, make it nearer real time. Opportunities to get consumers and others to drive comments and feedback into the system. And again, so improving the quality of the information that was available. To increase and coordinate education interventions and change the inspection process. Maybe prioritizing risky businesses over less risky, and also going remote or virtual for those inspections. So at the end of all of this, and it didn't take very long, it only took a few weeks to actually do the mapping, but the main products for us were the co-created and shared maps. And I emphasize co-created and shared. We had many different people in the room who were in their day jobs working on different parts of how the whole of this system worked. But typically, as many teams do, they worked in their own silos. So local authorities did their bit, the FSA team did their bit, my digital and data teams did their bit, and then there were all these other people outside that we didn't even know about. But what we had here was an ability to see everything that was going on, and an appreciation that if we changed something over here, we'd impact somebody else's bit over there. So in a sort of not dissimilar vein, continuing to map various parts of our external world. Food allergens. This is a really important high profile topic at the moment. And we've had Natasha's law that's just been introduced. So this is an example where, yes, food allergens have been around for a long time, but it was a relatively greenfield site. So here we decided to map, and it was much more a blank piece of paper, much more around trying to understand who the main actors were and where we might make the biggest intervention. So again, remember, this is looking at that wider world, again, seeing some of the familiar players like businesses and local authorities, and also the consumers at the top. So allergens affect some people directly and also affect many others indirectly, whether they be the parents or the carers or the businesses that are trying to help those allergy sufferers. So again, it's already got to quite a large community of interest. And what we're starting to see in here, and again, it's sort of picking up a little bit on that supply chain point, we're seeing tangible things going on in here. We're seeing things like guidance or inspections or those sorts of hard things. We've got kitchens, we've got websites, we've got information. But also what we're maybe getting more and more confident and adept at is thinking about the intangibles. So up at the top, we've got reducing stigma. So that the same map can have on it something like reduce stigma or change attitudes or take away fear, whatever that means for the particular situation, as well as typical hard stuff like a platform or a training course. So I think that's one of our sort of takeaways for the map, is the different types of things you can map. And maybe some of those sort of non-tangible things, they have proven to be a little bit harder for people to get their heads around. People are generally happier mapping a nice hard thing, unpacking it, understanding what goes on. Maybe start with the tangible, but then don't be afraid to move into the intangible, and the maps very much can help in that area. Moving on, just another example, another real need, but a different area. So we're seeing the growth in digital platforms in selling food, B2C, B2B, whether we see the food aggregators like sort of Just Eat being one type of platform, right the way through to somebody like Amazon or eBay, Facebook. So there's a huge range of different types of digital platform. And the problem that we have with that is that they're digital and they're hard to see. We're very much organized to regulate the physical world. We see food and shops and places in the high street. So these digital virtual platforms for us started off by being completely invisible. So that's been a challenge for us to try to see what's going on. And once we started to see what was going on and we started to map it, the next question, of course, is, so what should we do about it? Where do we intervene? What can we do to make those changes? And also, great believers in reuse, don't believe in creating anything from scratch unless we absolutely have to. We thought that safety tech being developed for other types of application, maybe covered by the Online Harms Bill, there's a growing capability and digital tools being developed over there. Maybe we could just pivot and apply that sort of technology into the food space, just to try and really see what was going on in the digital world. So again, a different sort of map involving different sorts of people in the conversation, but pulled together very quickly, just in a matter of hours, but proven to be really valuable as we get our head around a completely new subsector of the food system. So where next? So our world is no less confused than it was about 4 years ago. It's still complex and scary. We've mapped a lot of it, but also realized there's a lot more that we haven't seen, or equally a lot more that's emerging, because it's changing it very much in front of our eyes. And the pandemic that Rachel's touched on, that has had a huge impact on us in the last couple of years. Major knocks into the food system and how we've all had to respond to that. So the world is still a very difficult, complicated space, but that's not a reason to not go look and not try to understand it. So we will continue just to keep mapping, just to keep trying to understand what is going on and what we might do to make things just a little bit safer and a little bit better for all of our consumers. So where might we go next? So one idea I've got here is the food label. The food label, I've blown it up here because normally they're sort of a couple of centimeters big. So this little tiny thing that sits on the package, that I think the regulators think everybody reads assiduously. Can we map that label? So who are the actual users of it? Who is consuming the data that is on that label? Do we understand how and whether people consume the data? Are there other ways of consuming it rather than having it on a paper label? What else could we do? Is it properly targeted at the people who are really interested in all of that information? Can we add to what goes on the label? So we have the traffic light system in addition to ingredients. So let's add something for carbon footprint, net zero performance, etc., etc. So we're packing all of that potentially onto the food label. But also looking in the other direction, all of that data. So how did that data get there? is it good quality data? Is the path of the flow of the data through the system effective and efficient? And we've just been talking about supply chains, and for us, yes, the food supply chain, working through the pandemic, if you ever needed to have that supply chain being played out in front of you on a daily basis, that's what we've lived through. Where it's working, where it's not working, where it gets stuck. But I keep saying to people, there are, I can look at that supply chain, I look at the supply chain of food, and we need to understand that. But I'm looking at it as a supply chain of data. There is data flowing through the whole of that system. So maybe we need to get better at understanding the flow of data as well as the flow of the physical product, the food. So we're starting to get an increased interest in understanding the food system as a system. And we've been pushing for that over a number of years. And I would say that for me has been a positive byproduct coming out of the pandemic, just is that realization on the part of everybody that it is a whole of a system, and something tiny like carbon dioxide, suddenly people appreciate what a huge impact something so small can have. So mapping gives us an opportunity to understand the whole of the system and to understand some of those weak points or some of those key critical points where if you don't get it right, the system can really come under pressure and suffer. So I'm optimistic that we are starting to get a much greater appreciation of the system, appreciation of the importance of data within the system, how it works, how it could work in the future, how we might change it. And the food label is just one idea. But I would really welcome if anyone in the audience has got any other ideas, really welcome anyone else's thoughts. We want to just get it out there and carry on these conversations. And also anyone who wants to volunteer to be a mapper, because you are all actors in my system on a daily basis. So you're very welcome to join us and try to map the food system. And finally, some things don't change. We are still here trying to keep you all safe on a daily basis. So thank you very much.
Yay, that was excellent. Thank you so much. And you're so right. There were definitely themes across those two talks, even though they're completely different. Yeah, so thank you very much. There were definitely questions in the chat, so let's go to those. Yes, the first one is, how did you discover the components of your map? And seems like they're especially curious about freeloaders, and there was another question in the chat about like discovering actors. So if you could talk about that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, we discovered them by getting the right people in the room who actually understood what was going on. They might not realize they were experts, and often they sort of carried this information in their heads. They didn't think they had expertise or any particular insight, and it wasn't written down. But you get those people in the room, and you start off with the sort of the obvious simple stuff, and in doing so they sort of understand it, and then you ask sort of open questions as to is anyone else using this data? Or I can see somebody is taking a download through our API on a regular basis. Why are they doing that? They wouldn't do that unless they were going to use something with it, do something with it. So once you then started the process of thinking, there may be others or those consumers, those users and beneficiaries may be related to others. And once you've opened up, I think it's having the conversation and opening up to the different types, and also understanding, and again, I think Rachel touched on this, it's the need to often, people like Rachel and I, we might start with a digital service and we're starting with a thing that's that big. But again, coming back to the service design, it's very quick that we should be saying, hang on a minute, are we really understanding the end-to-end? Are we really understanding some of those other beneficiaries that sort of sit out there beyond just the simple consumer of the service? And so I think on putting that challenge on the table, you don't necessarily start there, but I think you need to take the conversation there to really be sure that you've got the whole thing mapped as well as you can.
Yeah, the idea that people are experts, even when they don't realize that they have expertise, that if anyone was at the MAP camp a couple of years ago, we talked about that in the fireside chat, and that's kind of how the Epistemic Justice League was born, right? Because we recognize that there are lots of people that are fish swimming in water, right? Like they're just doing the things that they do, and they're not even fully conscious of the expertise that they have. And one of the great things about Wardley mapping is that we can help get that expertise out, and we can use this shared language to kind of recognize those things. So excellent point. Rachel, you have your hand up.
Well, I thought I'd use a digital tool, Kat, to draw your attention. So the bit, just echoing what Julie said there, but I think there is so much power in subject matter experts. So I was teaching a group yesterday, Wardley mapping. They'd never seen it before, and their overriding view was, you know, we don't know how to map. And I said, well, you will in 30 minutes. So sit tight, because what we're really after is your subject matter expertise. And it's every time, you know, I teach it. Well, firstly, it's a privilege because it's such a powerful tool, but also the ability for people to then translate and have that debate. And that's the power, you know, to Julie's point about everybody being the expert. The knowledge is all there. We're using it as a tool to extract that in a language that is unified. And that for me is the real power of mapping.
Yeah, I totally agree. Absolutely. Okay. Yes, the next question, and I think I'm trying to go across the chat, the Q&A, and Twitter right now to try to bring you these questions. So I think this kind of touches on the theme, but this question is, in the case of remote inspections for these restaurants, was there any instances of fraud, or did you have to explore that at all?
That is a new area where we've started to explore the opportunity for remote inspection. We haven't, and the local authorities themselves haven't sort of done the thing. So we're expecting that whether it's fraud or misrepresentation, or maybe just being a bit silent on all of the information, yeah, we expect there to be a degree of that, and so we will need to design something in. I think the first thing for me is maybe the hardest thing, which was to sort of like let go of the physical inspection, and assuming whatever the problem was, the answer was going to be a physical inspection, and in many times you can either avoid the inspection, or it can be supplemented by other sources of data. So there are many different models, and again, the need has come through the pandemic. People just couldn't physically go visit. It was too risky from a COVID point of view, and so sort of needs must. But again, that's something that we've now will inherit both for us as the regulator, but also industry themselves.
Yeah. Okay.
And
cool.
also internationally, from a trade point of view, sort of certainly China was starting to do remote inspections, virtual inspections from China to the other side of the world. So yes, we're starting to see it more and more.
Yeah, I think we're picking up on a theme here again. You said something during your talk about everything that goes into having that one little green sticker appear on the door of the establishment. And I was thinking, gosh, everything that goes into, whatever, my cheeseburger that I'll eat later today, right? Like, yeah, of course, a lot of things have to go into that green sticker because there's hugely complex supply chains that go into the food that we eat every day. So just makes sense. We now have Mr. Simon Wardley. I don't know if anyone knows him chiming in the Q&A. So I suppose we'll entertain this question, maybe. But the question is, Brexit and COVID seem to have exposed how poorly we seem to understand the basics of our supply chains, or how the knowledge is trapped in individuals. I'm delighted to hear examples of mapping being used 10 years on from the Better for Less paper. How widespread is this in government? Any lessons or suggestions there?
Yes, I agree with Simon. The lack of understanding has been exposed. At the same time, where there is understanding and detail and how well it's managed has also been exposed. So we didn't know how well some bits were working, which was a surprise. Just sort of happened. I do think that the next thing for me is to move forward to better understand the supply chains. I think our first challenge is actually going to be trying to work out where to go first, because it is absolutely huge. And food doesn't exist in isolation. It requires the transportation, and then you suddenly find out that CO2 is used in animal slaughter, and it's used in your beer, and it's also used in fertilizer, and you sort of start to sort of map out, and it becomes really, really, really daunting. And then when we start to sort of map what's going on internationally with our imported food, we need to get ourselves into a place to not be completely sort of overfaced by all of that, thinking, oh my God, it's just too hard. So what I'm trying to do is to try to sort of identify where we might go next. The sticker, the label, is one sort of idea. There may be other sort of subsectors. You might choose a commodity like dairy or something like that. So you're just sort of slicing it, and in doing so, I think the maps will be useful. We will understand what is going on, and we will learn, and much of what we learn then becomes reusable elsewhere. And one of the super important byproducts is that capability. It's the shared language. It's just knowing what we're talking about when we talk about, or we'll move it over there to, down to the right hand side, or we'll do this, or where's the anchor. So I think just having the language is also super valuable in all of this anyway. So just another reason to start somewhere.
Rachel, you immediately unmuted when I asked the question. So I assume you have a strong response.
I thought there was no point being subtle with me digitally raising my hand this time. So I agree with Simon that so there's definitely work to be done on the supply chains, 200%. But I think that there is still work in the adoption of Wardley mapping across government. And I I was taught to map nearly 10 years ago when I was CIO at Department for Education, and it is something that I have seen across government, but it hasn't been adopted wholesale. So as a business, we've won business off the back of the ability we can map, because we have clients specifically asking for it. And I know Jonathan has asked a follow-on question around mapping and saying it's more consultancies that are driving that. Personally, I think that's a real shame, because if we go back to the point that we made, the power of this is about the subject matter experts. So a consultancy can't do this work for you. A consultancy can show you how to map, as can MapCamp, as can a whole raft of other online content. But the real power is the conversation, and it is about getting the real experts to have that conversation. So for me personally, if anybody is plugged into this session and works in government or healthcare and wants an hour or two of kicking the tires on mapping this side of Christmas, I will happily try to convince Julie off camera to join me and see if we couldn't do an hour or two and put a bit of a session on for anybody across government or healthcare to show them the basics, because I think this is an invaluable tool. And if there was wider adoption, we would have a much better understanding, not just of the department that we work in, but of the end-to-end service.
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy to do that, Rachel. And I'm really proud of some of our more recent maps, because with only a small amount of time, they should resonate with people. The stuff we're dealing with in this wider food domain, everybody should get the basics. I recognize that that's food. I recognize that that's a label. That's not hard. Oh, there's me up there. I'm a consumer. That I'm on the map. So I think those conversations are easy to have with everybody because you're an expert. Whereas where we started with some of the tech, you would be talking to people about it and they sort of, servers, completely lost me. God knows what that is. But we're now, as we now move into this sort of bigger real world, I actually think that the mapping language should become strangely easier.
Yep, absolutely agree. And I think the raft of digital tools that the community have built out, so whether it's, the Miro board for mapping, I know, Kat, you've shared another online tool that I haven't seen myself today. So, the digital aspect is absolutely caught up, but it's the conversation. If people want a bit of time to learn the basics, then, yeah, be delighted to help out.
A very generous offer from you both. Thank you so much. Even though I feel like Julie was more voluntold than volunteering.
always ready for speaking and engagements on mapping. That's well known.
Okay, cool. I want to pick up on something there. Yes, there was a lot there, but so we're talking about why isn't there wider spread adoption in government? And Julie, during your talk, you specifically emphasized co-created and shared. How did you share? Like literally how? Because I've seen people put up like a huge map with tons of nodes on it and then talk through it. I've seen people build a map in kind of piece by piece or chunk by chunk. How did you share the map in an effective way?
Well, a couple of things. One is most of the sharing was actually by the people in the room. We tried to get as many people as we possibly could into the room. And whilst we had a number of sessions and people were creating their own or building on another one that had been created, and the whole thing was really messy, but that didn't matter at all. So the main sort of sharing was by being there and owning it. The other thing is also for me as to whether or not how having said that map is really, really important, and I've said this to Simon before, I do this because I think of the world in maps anyway, so that's what's going on in my head anyway. Equally well, and I've tried to draw this out in my presentation, was the map, that's not the end, the map. It's the so what did we do about it? And so the what did we do about it, we're sort of seeing on some of our arrows, which will translate down into we created a training course, or we implemented this, or we built a thing. And then you're then heading off down into, you know, normal traditional sort of design and delivery territory. So I don't want to, or you may be taking the map down to another level of detail as you design a particular part of a digital service that you've decided is needed. But I think we need to understand what the maps are there for, and then everything else that has to happen. It has to be action of some sort.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat back what I think I heard, and you can tell me how wrong I am. But the co-created and the shared necessarily go together. So
Yeah.
even if it is kind of going viral and like, okay, well, someone took this chunk of the map and then continued the creation with another group, but the co-created and the shared go together. Yes,
Correct.
Is that right?
Very
and
much.
Then
yes.
The actual artifact of the map is not really the thing. It's what that inspires us to do, or the questions that prompts the investigation, that all of those things. So that sharing the artifact is kind of like, meh.
Yeah, it's how to make those movements, how to move what you've got on the map. You can identify where you want to move it, and so what is it that sits to make that happen.
Okay, cool. Rachel, are you thinking deeply, or were you going to comment?
I was just nodding furiously. I think I think the artifact is important, but I think the conversation is so important. And the bit that I never ever, the bit that always amuses me or amazes me is when you've got people that work in the same team or same department or same organization. You ask them to describe something that goes on, and you've got 10 people in the room, and every one of them calls a system or a widget something different. And then as they're explaining it, you know, that kind of power of the room getting behind, oh, this is actually what it means. That's what you're getting at. Is just invaluable.
Yeah, totally agree. That's been my experience as well. One other thing, since I can ask whatever I want. Oh, actually, we have a question in the chat, and it's one that I'm super interested in. So Jonathan is back with another question. Thank you, Jonathan. We have a large focus on accessibility at the moment. I'm struggling to see how people with visual impairments can take part in mapping and get value from it. Do you have experience with this? Do either of you have experience? I do, so I can certainly give my thoughts.
I don't, so I wouldn't profess to try and answer this one.
Okay, I'll say what I've done before, and then Rachel and Julie, you can tell me how wrong it is and how badly it needs to be improved. But I actually, someone who is more and more active in the mapping community, Jimmy Judd, you can look him up. He's on Twitter and things like that, but he is blind and he's a mapper. And what we did mapping together was really take advantage of the language, right? That we have a shared set of language. So that language is actually really rich for describing the landscape, right? And yes, we have this visual artifact that's there, right? But we can also just describe a landscape with that language. And now that we have the amazing online Wardley mapping, which I shared in the chat, and then there's also a VS Code plugin now Same thing. So that's using the Wordly mapping language to generate a map, like it's code sort of. That has also been really helpful because that you can read that with a screen reader, and that's something that I found to be really, really helpful. And I will also take this opportunity to plug Ben Mosher's YouTube channel. I think it's Learn Wordly Mapping. I'm not sure. I'll find a link and I'll post it. But Jimmy and Ben did some mapping together on that YouTube channel. So if you're curious about that, go for it. Maybe next year we'll have Jimmy as a map camp speaker if I can convince him, or if all of you want to help me peer pressure him. He's an excellent speaker. But that's the approach that we used for Wordly mapping together. And I think it's been successful. I think Jimmy feels the same way. So yeah.
We'd love to give that a try. I admit we haven't, we've just completely failed so far. But yeah, we would want to make sure that the maps are as accessible as possible.
Yeah, I just can't say enough good things about the VS Code plugin, the online Wordly Maps VS Code plugin. Like, it is fantastic. I love it. And I think it goes a long way in providing accessible maps. So yes. Yes. So we're reaching the end of our time, I think. So maybe we can do some parting thoughts, and I'll start with mine so that Rachel and Julie have time to think about yours. But something that really stood out to me, yes, we covered the supply chain stuff is common, but something that really stood out to me was basically, what are the boundaries of a map? Like Rachel talked about, oh, and we got to get all of these pieces to somehow align, and people have to have a lot of faith and goodwill. And then Julie, you were talking about, there's the supply chain for this food is just so expansive. And I started to think about something that Mel Conway told me. He said, you can zoom in forever or you could zoom out forever, right? And neither of those exercises are helpful. And he sent me the ACOF talk, From Mechanistic to Systems Thinking. And ACOF says that, right? That it's not helpful to zoom in forever. It's not helpful to zoom out forever. You have to be somewhere, right? So that seemed like a real thread, both in terms of like, we could zoom in forever in terms of the supply chain, we could zoom out same way, we could zoom in forever like on the actors and zoom out, but also time. That struck me, right? That we could zoom in on time this instant, we could zoom out forever, and neither of those are going to be really helpful. We have to like pick a scope if we're going to move forward. So that was something that just really stood out to me across both of them. I think maybe because there is the pressure of safety, that's not something that you can sit there forever. Oh gosh, gee whiz, let me get philosophical and zoom way out on this, right? Like, there's a pressing concern. You have to do something, and it has to be at an appropriate scale. So yeah. I don't know if you, Julie?
Yeah, no, I was just, as you say, thank you for the time to think. And yeah, it's a great point. First, you mentioned time, and I think time is really important anyway. So whilst we shouldn't be infinitely worrying about time, at the same time, I think it is healthy for us to spend a bit more time thinking about timeliness, how fast things move, how tightly coupled things are from a time perspective. So I would be pushing much more for people to think about that. Then your your point around the sort of like the boundaries and the, you know, zooming out and zooming in and infinite scales, etc. Two things there. I think one is, yes, it's dangerous, I agree, but one is that the mapping makes you aware of the boundaries. It makes you ask the question as to, we going too far? Do we still need to go out here, or have we done enough's enough? But being able to map it means that you can actually have that conversation around some of those nether regions around the map. So I think that's powerful, and everyone can then decide and have a sort of a joint understanding of why we're putting the boundary where we do. And the other was, and all of my examples did start with this, and maybe I should have brought it out more. It is that anchor, it's that use case, it's that particular sort of situation, it's the problem I'm trying to solve. So we weren't just sort of heading off generally to go map the food system because it looked fun. It was because somebody suggested we needed to do something to address a particular problem that we were facing, a real problem. So what do we do? What's the response? And again, it comes back to the so what that comes out of the whole process. You go in with that problem, and then you come out with process, even if in the meantime you realize that you might have asked the wrong question in the first place. So going in might be an iterative exercise as you go in, but yeah, go in with that use case, with that problem statement.
I can't imagine that mapping the food system wouldn't be an exciting task, Julie. I
do it in my spare time.
The bit for me, Kat, and you'd answered the question actually yourself, but the bit for me is about it's the business context. So I'm not that philosophical. And so that's the bit where I get bored. And so it's much more around how wide do you go is in line with the business context. So I like the zooming in and the zooming out. But even yesterday when in teaching mapping again, and you know, there's always somebody, if you're doing the analogy of the cafe, that wants to talk about a cow in the field for the milk, and it's like, you know, not the point. So it's just about, you know, enough. For me, but I'm somebody with a seriously short attention span, so therefore that might have something to do with it. The other reflection for me, I think, is around two reflections, of one around supply chain and understanding that aspect more, and the other bit is around the adoption of mapping, because the power of it is just so far reaching, and I really think that we're missing a trick from a government and a NHS perspective, not utilising it more. So yeah, that's another reflection from me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And thank you for spending a little bit of extra time, because we didn't have a third speaker, but I'm actually very happy that we got that extra time for questions. So I really, really appreciate it. And to the folks who are in attendance, I hope to see you later today on the society track. Reminder, all of the talks are recorded. So if you feel you must visit another track, don't worry, because you can watch the talks later. I will also just say that Mel Conway, who I mentioned earlier, is giving a talk later. I think it's the next session on this track, if you're interested in that. I think that's it. And a reminder, there's a networking space, and I'll probably pop over there for a few minutes to say hello to folks after we leave here, but I think that's it. So thank you both so much, and thank you to the audience. Great questions.
No, thank you.
Brill. Yeah, thanks, Kat. You did a brilliant job. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye all.